Today's speaker is Lee Pollock, who is a writer, historian, and public speaker on the life and times of Winston Churchill. He has served as a trustee and advisor to the board, plus now serves as the executive director of the International Churchill Society, the leading worldwide organization dedicated to preserving Churchill's legacy for future generations. His activity in regard to the Churchill legacy is far too extensive for me to properly summarize, but I'm sure you will pick up on his enthusiasm and expertise on the subject after listening to his program. I give you Lee Pollock.
Thank you, John, for that kind introduction. Hopefully we're good on the mic. Can you guys hear me? Great. I had the pleasure of speaking to this society 2 years ago about the fascinating relationship between Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. Hopefully some of you were able to hear that. I'm delighted to return this morning to speak about a different aspect of Churchill's life, the role that religion and his own sense of destiny played in his remarkable career. I understand that the Ethical Humanist Society was founded in 1882, which was only 8 years after Churchill's birth. Churchill loved historic organizations, and he belonged to many of them. He also liked independent-minded, free-thinking people, so I think he'd be very much at home here. And he'd be especially pleased that he was the topic of this morning's discussion. I'd like to begin with 2 episodes from Churchill's life, which I think set the stage for this discussion. On the evening of May 10th, 1940, Winston Churchill was driven to Buckingham Palace to receive the commission of King George VI to form a new government to lead Britain in the Second World War. 2 days before, an intense debate in the House of Commons had exposed the failures of Neville Chamberlain's government and its policy of appeasement, and Chamberlain resigned. But ominously, the very morning that Churchill took office, the German Wehrmacht crossed into Belgium, Holland, and France, advancing with astonishing speed and success. The so-called phony war, which had begun in September 1939, was over. Adolf Hitler's Blitzkrieg had begun, and it would change history. As his car returned from the palace, Churchill was unusually quiet. His bodyguard, Inspector Walter Thompson, attempted to break the silence by congratulating his boss, but expressing the hope that the appointment had not come too late. Churchill paused for a moment and somberly replied, "I hope it is not too late as well. We can only do our best." But a few hours later, Churchill's mood had lightened considerably. He later wrote in one of the most famous passages in his war memoirs, "As I went to bed at 3 a.m., I was conscious of a profound sense of relief. At last I had the authority to give direction over the whole scene. I felt as if I were walking with destiny and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and this trial. I was sure I would not fail." In Winston Churchill's walk with destiny lay the fate of Britain, of freedom, and of Western civilization itself. But that singular moment was just one example of Winston Churchill's belief in himself. When he was stationed as a young army officer in India, almost half a century before, he told his mother in a letter, "I have faith in my star. I am intended to do something in the world." 2 months later, after a dangerous skirmish on the northwest frontier of India, Churchill expressed no surprise at his survival, saying, perhaps not entirely in jest, "I am so conceited. I do not believe the gods would create so potent a being as myself for so prosaic an ending." And when Churchill was a 16-year-old student at Harrow in 1891, he and a fellow pupil, Merland Evans, spent a casual hour after mandatory Sunday evening chapel services discussing the future. Evans was stunned to hear Churchill say, "I can see vast changes, great upheavals, terrible struggles, wars such as one cannot imagine. I see further ahead than you do into the future. London will be in danger, and in the high position I shall occupy, it will fall to me to save the capital and the empire. How many 16-year-olds do you know, then or now, who would have such faith in themselves? It was quite remarkable. Let's talk about how Churchill came to believe in that destiny and look at his distinctive and very personal relationship with God and religion and how those elements came together to shape his remarkable life. It's sometimes said that people absorb religion from their mother's milk. So let's start with his formative years. Churchill was born at one of Britain's grandest homes, Blenheim Palace, in November 1874. His family descended from one of the nation's greatest military leaders, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. Churchill's grandfather was the seventh Duke, and his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, an up-and-coming young politician. Lord Randolph had been elected to Parliament just 10 months before, but was already considered by some to be a potential future prime minister. The family stood at the heart of a small and aristocratic elite that ruled Britain and its enormous global empire, the greatest since the days of Rome, 2,000 years before. They were, of course, members of the Church of England, and young Winston was duly baptized in December, just before Christmas. This was the established Church of England, wealthy and influential, whose head was the sovereign, Queen Victoria herself, then in the fourth decade of her reign. While Catholicism and dissenting Protestant denominations had their place, the domination of Anglicanism in Britain's national life was very clear. Churchill's American mother, Jenny Jerome, was born in Brooklyn, the daughter of a mercurial but eventually wealthy financier named Leonard Jerome. He was of God-fearing Puritan stock, descended from a French Huguenot immigrant in the early 18th century. But history would show there was little of the Puritan in Jenny Jerome. Neither Jenny nor Lord Randolph were what we would call today hands-on parents. In fact, the opposite was the case. Preoccupied by their active social and political lives, like many Victorian parents, they were absent, distant, and sadly removed from the young child's daily life. Churchill's relationship with both of them was conflicted and troubled, although he eventually became close to his mother, whose support was vital in his early career. He said that, quote, "She shone for me like the evening star," but added, "I loved her dearly, but at a distance." As to his father, the historical record is filled with harsh letters of disappointment and recrimination. They are painful to read from father to son, even today, almost 150 years later. With both parents so often absent, Churchill's upbringing fell heavily to a beloved family retainer, his nanny, Elizabeth Everest. Although she never married, she was always known as Mrs. She showed him the attention and affection that his parents lacked. She also attempted to imbue him with her low church principles and her disdain for Catholicism. She had a particular dislike for the Pope on the doubtful grounds that he was behind all the Fenian troubles in Ireland. And while they eventually faded, Churchill held anti-Catholic views into his 20s, complaining to his brother in 1898 about, quote, "the damnable errors and wicked notions of the Catholic Church." Churchill's first exposure to organized religion came when he attended St. George's, a fashionable elementary school in Ascot. There he was subject to two ordeals, flogging for impertinence and forced attendance at what he called, quote, "frequent religious services of a somewhat high church character." He found neither experience especially enjoyable. Fortunately for young Winston, he soon left St. George's for a much less punitive school at Brighton, but could not escape high church worship. At the recitation of the Apostles' Creed, everyone turned to the east, except young Winston, in deference to Mrs. Everest's example. He thought he'd be punished, but the school administrators were lenient, and his sense of rebellion evaporated. He later wrote that he became, quote, willy-nilly a passive conformist. In 1888, at age 14, Churchill entered Harrow, then as now one of Britain's elite public schools. As many of you know, that confuses Americans because public schools in Britain, Eton is the most famous, are decidedly private. There he attended 3 services every Sunday, along with evening prayers throughout the week. He later remarked of this time with his usual wit, "All this was very good. I accumulated in those years so fine a surplus in the bank of observance that I have been drawing confidently on it ever since. Weddings, christenings, and funerals have brought in a steady annual income, and I have never made close inquiries about the state of my account. It might well even be that I should find an overdraft." Churchill was thought, especially by his father, to be unsuited for the 2 great universities of Victorian England, Oxford and Cambridge. He briefly flirted with the idea of becoming a clergyman, one of the few occupations, along with the law, the military, and politics, that was thought suitable for aristocrats. But on his 3rd attempt, he was admitted to the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, Britain's equivalent of West Point, but without the same intellectual rigor. His 2 years there focused primarily on military subjects, and after graduation, he was stationed with the 4th Hussars in Bangalore in southern India. The life of a junior army officer in the Raj was leisurely. Early morning drills and exercises were followed by lunch and a lengthy afternoon break. Most of his colleagues spent that time playing polo, drinking, or sleeping through the hot Indian sun. But Winston Churchill was far too restless and ambitious for that. He recognized what he had missed by foregoing a university education and was determined to make up for that. He enlisted his mother in the effort, sending her long lists of books to be forwarded to him. For 4 or 5 hours a day, he pored over the great philosophers and historians of his and earlier times: Gibbon, Macaulay, Plato and Aristotle, Schopenhauer, Malthus, and Darwin. And in the course of that reading, he began to ponder religion. 3 authors in particular diminished his belief in conventional Christianity, and more dramatically, in the divinity of Christ itself. Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire and William Lecky's The Rise of Rationalism established in his mind what he later called, quote, a predominantly secular view of life. But it was a book by an author named William Winwood Reade, entitled The Martyrdom of Man, that convinced Churchill that Jesus was an inspired prophet, but not the Son of God. Reade, who is little known today, was born in 1838 and died just 6 months after Churchill's birth. He was a polymath, an explorer, novelist, and war correspondent, and this 2-volume work was widely popular after it was published in 1872. It employed Darwinian terms to explain the rise and fall of empires ranging from the Persians to the Romans. While he was not strictly an atheist, Reade was scathing about all forms of organized religion, which he dismissed as worthless superstition. Reade likened Jesus to, quote, the noble prophets of the ancient period. He preached the religion of the heart. He offered consolation to the poor. But, Reade added, Christ was, quote, the subject of a remarkable hallucination. He believed he was the Messiah. In his own charming memoir, My Early Life, published in 1930, Churchill recounted that many evenings in India were spent in discussion with his fellow officers about God and religion. In Churchill's words, we used to argue questions like whether we should live again in another world. There was general agreement that if you tried your best to live an honorable life and were not unkind to the weak and poor, it did not matter much what you believed or disbelieved. That is what I nowadays call the religion of healthy-mindedness. Their time in India generated a common belief among Churchill and his contemporaries that living an ethical life was what really mattered, while beliefs or disbeliefs were of little consequence. Thus, by the time Churchill was in his mid-20s, his belief in conventional Christianity had been lost. In another passage from my early life, he noted the challenge of rationalizing faith. He said, "If I had been at university, my difficulties would have been resolved by the eminent professors who would have shown me equally convincing books with the opposite point of view. As it was, I passed through a violent and aggressive anti-religious phase, which, had it lasted, might easily have made me a nuisance." Churchill had not become an atheist, but at the least a skeptical rationalist. In his one and only novel, he wrote, "We are inconsequential atoms. I realize my own insignificance. I am but a philosophical microbe." Writing to his mother, Jenny, in 1898, he said, "I expect annihilation at death. I am a materialist to my fingertips." Another letter 6 months later added, "I do not accept the Christian or any other forms of religious belief." But while Churchill had little interest in the practice of conventional religion himself, and Reed's book impressed him deeply, he was wary of a wholesale rejection of religion or attack on the faith of others. Even though, to Churchill's mind, Reed had shown the falseness of Christian dogma, Churchill mused that it might not have been wise for him to do so. Churchill noted that there might come a time when, quote, "Christianity will be put aside as a crutch which is no longer needed, but until then, anyone who deprives people of their illusions is a wicked man." The historian Paul Addison has summed up Churchill's beliefs at this time in his life this way: "For orthodox religion, Churchill substituted a secular belief in historical progress with a strong emphasis on the civilizing mission of the British Empire. This was accompanied by mystical faith, alternating with cynicism in the workings of Providence." As Churchill's life unfolded, Providence and the unseen force seemed to take special interest in his survival, an interest which Churchill was not embarrassed to note. After India, he saw action in the Sudan, participating in fierce hand-to-hand combat in one of the last cavalry charges in the British Empire. He was then famously and spectacularly captured by and then escaped from the Boers in the Boer War. He wrote of those times, quote, "I did not hesitate to ask for special protection when about to come under the fire of the enemy, nor to feel sincerely grateful when I came home safely to afternoon tea." Once, when he was on active duty during the First World War, his dugout was destroyed by a German shell just moments after he left it, decapitating a junior officer. Churchill observed, quote, "I had the strong sensation that a hand had been stretched out to move me in the nick of time from a fatal spot." 15 years later, he was severely injured in a car accident on New York's Fifth Avenue and asked, quote, "I do not understand why I was not broken like an eggshell or squashed like a gooseberry." Churchill, of course, was a practicing and practical politician for some 60 years of his life, so he was aware that trumpeting his religious beliefs, or lack thereof, might undermine his career. Professed atheists or agnostics did not make good candidates, especially for the Conservative Party, which had taken Churchill back into its ranks in 1924. So despite his own shallow faith, Churchill recognized the value of invoking God and religion and harnessing them to politics through his own writing and speaking. In January 1920, defending British efforts to topple the new Bolshevik government in Russia, he claimed, quote, "We defend freedom of conscience and religious equality. They seek to exterminate every form of religious belief." He later added, quote, "The strangling of Bolshevism at its birth would have been an untold blessing to the human race." And most notably, his opposition from 1933 on to Nazi Germany included its suppression of freedom of religion and its oppression of the Jews. During the Second World War, Churchill's use of religious and Christian metaphors was especially pronounced as Britain engaged in a Manichaean struggle with a German dictator who was as close to the Antichrist as could be imagined. He drew deeply on religious vernacular and imagery despite his own lack of belief. Words like salvation, sacrifice, faith, and most notably the struggle to preserve, quote, Christian civilization regularly infused his language. Combining these with his belief in destiny, providence, and fate produced the most compelling and powerful rhetoric of the 20th century. Churchill took advantage of religious pageantry when the opportunity arose, most notably in August 1941, when he personally supervised the Sunday worship service aboard the British battleship, the Prince of Wales, which had been anchored off the coast of Newfoundland for the Atlantic Charter Conference with Franklin Roosevelt. American support was critical to Britain's survival, and Churchill searched for anything that would emphasize the two nations' common moral and spiritual heritage. The result was a service that included Onward Christian Soldiers and O God Our Help in Ages Past. Churchill sang the words by heart and was seen to weep as the music played on. But there were still some skeptics about all this. His doctor, Lord Moran, once complained, "King and country in that order, that's about the only religion Winston has." And Churchill's selection of friends leaned to unspiritual characters, including what his somewhat more religious wife Clementine called the terrible bees. They were Brendan Bracken, Lord Beaverbrook, and Churchill's closest friend, Lord Birkenhead. None of them were recognized as men of faith or of particular morality. Churchill once justified his own lack of observance and his spotty church attendance by saying, "I am not a pillar of the church, but I am a buttress. I support it from the outside." Ceremonial occasions, family christenings, weddings, and funerals were about the only things that drew him past those buttresses and into the pillars. But when he did attend, he favored traditional liturgy as befitted an aristocratic Tory who loved the English language. He said, quote, "As for the revised version of the Bible and the alterations in the Book of Common Prayer, they are grievous." Churchill also thought often about death and the possibility of heaven or some other afterlife. He was not convinced, once describing death as, quote, "black velvet, eternal sleep." It held no terrors for him, and his advice was, quote, "Let us accept the natural order in which we move." And a return to earth did not appeal to him, as he commented, "Life is a whole, and good and evil must be accepted together. The journey has been enjoyable and well worth making, but only once." His attitude to religion could sometimes be irreverent or even flippant. During the Second World War, his friend, the devout South African Prime Minister Jan Christian Smuts, complained that Churchill never appealed to what Smuts called Christian motives. Churchill's comeback, referring to his power as head of the government to make ecclesiastical appointments, was, "My friend, I have made more bishops than St. Augustine." While that wasn't technically correct, he did appoint 2 archbishops of Canterbury during the war. When one of them, a pious and ascetic man named William Temple, died at age 63 after only 2 years in office, Churchill took humorous note of the fact that he himself was already 7 years older than that, and despite a steady diet of alcohol, cigars, and fattening food, was going quite strong. At other times, politics clashed with religion. Churchill was not fond of George Bell, the Bishop of Chichester, who criticized area bombing of German cities, supported trade unions, and perhaps most annoying of all, invited Gandhi, the leader of the Indian independence movement that Churchill opposed, to speak at his cathedral. Churchill made sure that Bishop Bell was never promoted. Perhaps you might also wonder what Churchill thought of other faiths that he encountered in his long life, particularly the two other great monotheistic religions, Islam and Judaism, as well as the Hindus he observed in India. Let's start with the Jews, and being Jewish myself, I find this subject of interest. I actually give a full-length talk on this, which perhaps I'll do here another time. At the time of Churchill's birth in 1874, the Jewish community in Britain had a long history dating back most recently to the time of Oliver Cromwell, some 4 centuries before. But that community was still modest in size, and anti-Semitism of either the social or more ominously racial kind was widespread. It was only in 1858, just 16 years before Churchill's birth, that the first Jew was able to sit in the House of Commons. Fittingly, that was Lionel de Rothschild, a son of Europe's wealthiest and most famous Jewish family. Instead of taking the oath of office on, quote, the true faith of a Christian, he covered his heads and added the words, "So help me, Jehovah." Churchill's father, Lord Randolph, although part of a family at the center of British life, was notably immune to the prevailing negative attitude to Jews. He numbered several Jewish people among his closest personal friends, although they were, of course, from the wealthiest segment of the community. And he was criticized by his Gentile peers for doing that. His son Winston came into contact with these Jewish friends at an early age, and after Lord Randolph died when Winston was only 20, these Jews served as financial advisors and mentors to him. Both father and son can rightly be considered early Philo-Semites. For a few years early in the new century in his political career, Churchill represented a constituency in Manchester where the electorate was 1/3 Jewish. That solidified his connection to the Jews, especially when he began a lifelong friendship with a prominent local chemist who was active in a new movement advocating a national home for the Jews in Palestine, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire. That movement, which the British government recognized in the famous Balfour Declaration in 1917, was called Zionism, and the chemist was Chaim Weizmann. 43 years after that meeting with Churchill, Weizmann became the first president of the State of Israel, in whose creation the dream of Zionism was finally realized. Churchill later became embroiled in Middle East politics when, as colonial secretary after the First World War, he helped draw the boundaries of 2 new states, Jordan and Iraq, and established the British Mandate of Palestine. As he became more familiar with the Jews and their history, his admiration grew. He recognized, quote, that some people like Jews and some do not, but added, no thoughtful man can deny the fact that they are beyond question the most formidable and the most remarkable race which has ever appeared in the world. By the way, Churchill did not use race in the biological sense, but as a synonym for an ethnic or national group, and it actually referred to the English in the same way. Churchill's affection for the Jews was reciprocated as they recognized his continuing support for their interests in Palestine. He said the establishment there of a Jewish home would, quote, be a tremendous event in the history of the world. And most importantly of all, he became associated in Jewish minds with opposition to the genocidal plans of Adolf Hitler. During the 1930s, Churchill was the leading voice against appeasement of Germany. And from May 1940 until June the following year, he led Britain as it stood as the only barrier to Hitler's domination of all of Europe. While Churchill saw the Jews as a distinctive ethnic group, a race in his words, he also thought about and respected Judaism as a religion. Churchill's official biographer, the late Sir Martin Gilbert, noted, Churchill, like many of his contemporaries, was deeply versed in the Bible. But unlike many of them, biblical stories were not simply something he had read and vaguely remembered. They were something he dramatized. Another historian, Darrell Hawley, explains that for Churchill, the Bible was, quote, a primary source of interesting illustrations, descriptive images, and stirring phrases. His knowledge of the Bible manifested itself in quotations and in the frequent, perhaps even unconscious use of biblical terms and phrases. Churchill's interest in the scriptures, and especially in the dramatic characters they presented, was apparent in a 1931 magazine article he wrote entitled Moses, the Leader of a People. It was part of a series called Great Bible Stories Retold by the World's Best Writers. And to be honest, it was a bit of a potboiler, written because Churchill, for much of that decade, was scrounging for money to support his extravagant upper-class lifestyle. But the article is interesting nonetheless. As Martin Gilbert notes, quote, Churchill takes issue with people who said that Moses was only an allegorical figure. In Gilbert's words, Churchill said, no, Moses' identity and leadership were a genuine historical event. Martin Gilbert added, what had excited Churchill about the Moses story was, on the one hand, the Jewish destiny, God's promise to the Jews, and on the other hand, Jewish ethics. In Churchill's own words, the closing words of the book of Deuteronomy are an apt expression of the esteem in which the great leader and liberator of the Hebrew people was held by generations that succeeded him. Even at a time when his own political future was clouded, Churchill undoubtedly identified with a great figure from ancient times, saying, Moses was the greatest of the prophets who spoke in person to the God of Israel. He was the national leader who led the chosen people out of the land of bondage, through the wilderness, and to the threshold of the promised land. That is surely prophetic of Churchill's own role in the world crisis of 1940. Churchill summarized his view of the Jewish religion this way: we owe to the Jews a system of ethics which is incomparably the most precious possession of mankind. On that system and by that faith, there has been built, out of the wreck of the Roman Empire, the whole of modern civilization. Churchill's opinions about Islam are of interest as well, especially in the context of recent history, when the relationship between the Muslim world and the West has been troubled and mired in controversy. As often happens, Churchill's words have been drawn into discussion. Do a Google search on Churchill and Islam, and the following quotation of his will come up quickly. It reads, how dreadful are the curses which Mohammedanism lays on its votaries. Besides the fanatical frenzy, there is a fearful fatalistic apathy wherever the followers of the prophet rule or live. The quotation continues, individual Muslims may show splendid qualities, but the influence of the religion paralyzes the development of those who follow it. No stronger retrograde force exists in the world. And then it concludes, Mohammedanism, which was how it was referred to in those days, is a militant and proselytizing faith. Were it not that Christianity is sheltered in the strong arms of science, the civilization of modern Europe might fall. That is quite a statement, so it's not surprising that vigorous critics of Islam and outright Islamophobes repeat it regularly today. But where does it come from, and is it an accurate exposition of Churchill's real views? The quotation is from Churchill's second book, a 2-volume account published in 1899 entitled The River Wars. It's a very vivid and personal account focused on Churchill's military service of the war which Britain waged against the Mahdi rebellion in the Sudan, which had begun the previous decade. In that conflict, Churchill participated in the cavalry charge at the Battle of Omdurman in the near final stages of the war in 1898. That was a very one-sided affair. The British, under General Herbert Kitchener, suffered just 427,000 casualties. Some 25,000 Muslim warriors were killed or wounded. The tribal forces the British defeated were known as dervishes, and they were the Taliban or ISIS of their day, determined to purify their faith and expel foreign influences. They hardly represented the much larger mass of Muslims in other parts of the British Empire, including millions living in Egypt and especially important in India. The relatively inexperienced 25-year-old Churchill wrote harshly of the fundamentalism and fanaticism of the dervishes. But his condemnation is best seen as being the product of a narrow time and place rather than of a faith as the whole. Indeed, at that time, as I've noted, Churchill was dismissive of any organized religion, including Christianity. In future years, Churchill's view of Muslims evolved, and he became more admiring, even though his knowledge of Islam was largely predicated on Victorian notions that romanticized the noble life and desert culture of the Bedouins. Churchill's evolving views were reflected in his friendship with Arabists such as Wilfrid Blunt, the poet and political radical, and with Churchill's especially close associate, a British Army officer, Colonel T.E. Lawrence, better known, of course, as Lawrence of Arabia. Churchill's opinions of Muslims were also influenced by their large presence in India, which in the imperial age also included what are now Pakistan and Bangladesh. Muslims in disproportionate numbers made up the backbone of the Indian Army, which was led by British officers but otherwise formed from the local population. The Indian Army was critical for keeping the jewel of the crown within the empire, the preservation of which was one of the most important of Churchill's political goals. Although Churchill could never be said to have acquired a truly deep understanding of Islam, he valued these modern Muslim warriors. He thought them to be part of a martial race and an important counterpart to the more numerous Hindus, of whom Churchill was far less fond. The Hindus, Churchill felt, failed to appreciate the benefits of British rule. The agitation for independence of the Hindu-dominated Indian National Congress and its leader, Mahatma Gandhi, vexed Churchill for 3 decades. And in his frustration, he let loose some classic insults. The Indians, he said, are, quote, a beastly people with a beastly religion. In 1942, Churchill predicted the following to Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador in London, should the British be forced to leave India. He said, eventually the Muslims will become masters because they are warriors while the Hindus are windbags. Of course, when it comes to fine speeches, skillful resolutions, and legalistic castles in the air, the Hindus are experts. But when it comes to business, when something must be decided on quickly, implemented, and executed, here the Indians say pass and immediately reveal their internal flabbiness. Churchill's criticisms of the caste system, the Brahmin treatment of untouchables, and the persistence of customs such as child marriage were well-founded. But even his staunchest admirers recognized that his views on Indians and Hinduism were generally more than anachronistic and intolerant. It was only in the 1950s, after the partition of the subcontinent and Indian independence, that Churchill's views mellowed. He developed a close and respectful relationship with India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. That admittedly was fostered by the fact that Nehru, just like Churchill, was a graduate of Harrow. So remember, the next time someone lectures you with certainty about the Middle East, Islam, and terrorism, and invokes Winston Churchill, remind them that they know only half the story. Let's go back now to a few final words about Churchill and Christianity. Churchill's lack of Christian faith did not diminish his regard for Jesus as a person, one whom he held in great regard. One of his friends, Desmond Morton, said that while Churchill, quote, did not believe that Christ was God, he recognized him as one of the finest characters who ever lived. In 1952, during Churchill's second term as Prime Minister, His devoted private secretary, Jacques Colville, recorded the following conversation as Churchill walked in the garden of the Prime Minister's country residence, Chequers, with Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. "How did Churchill define a great man?" Montgomery asked. "Was Hitler great?" "No," answered Churchill. "He made too many mistakes." Then the two discussed whether great religious leaders were the truly great men. Churchill said, quote, "Their greatness was indisputable, but it was of a different kind. Christ's story was unequaled," he continued, and, quote, "his death to save sinners unsurpassed. Moreover, the Sermon on the Mount was the last word in ethics." Churchill came to refer to God as, quote, "the old man," which ironically was the name given to Churchill himself by his younger colleagues as he entered the 9th decade of his life in the 1950s and 60s. A few years earlier, on his 75th birthday in 1949, Churchill quipped, "I am ready to meet my Maker. Whether my Maker is prepared for the great ordeal of meeting me is another matter." That meeting was not to occur for another 16 years, and Churchill wanted a grand send-off. His state funeral at St. Paul's Cathedral in January 1965 was perhaps the greatest in British history and attracted a worldwide audience. Some 110 heads of government attended. Churchill was particularly interested in the music to be played and chose the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which he said would be a tribute to his American mother, another one called "Fight the Good Fight," and once again, "O God, our help in ages past." We don't know how Churchill's meeting with the old man went, if it in fact did occur. He expressed some anxiety about heaven, fearing that it might be an egalitarian place like the British welfare state that had been created by the Labour Party, and, quote, "therefore no place for me." But Churchill was intrigued by the possibility of meeting great men from the past, such as Julius Caesar and Napoleon. He certainly thought that history would rank him as their equal. Other aspects of heaven appealed to him more. Churchill was a devoted and talented painter for over 40 years. He longed to spend more time at it, so commented, quote, "When I get to heaven, I mean to spend a considerable portion of my first million years in painting so as to get to the bottom of the subject." In his book, My Early Life, Churchill made the following insightful observation on the difficulty felt by people in reconciling belief and reason. He said, "Why do they want to reconcile them? If you are the recipient of a message which cheers your heart and fortifies your soul, which promises you reunion with those you have loved, why should you worry about the envelope it comes in or whether the date on the postcard is right or wrong?" And Churchill continued, "I adopted quite early in life a system of believing whatever I wanted to believe, while at the same time leaving reason to pursue unfettered whatever paths she was capable of treading." The distinguished British historian Andrew Roberts, who has just written an outstanding new biography of Churchill, makes the following observation about Churchill's words. "His is a message as wise as it is tolerant and totally consistent with his so-called religion of healthy-mindedness. Churchill might not have believed that he had an immortal soul, but if he did, it was undoubtedly a great one." So how would I now sum up the subject of Churchill, God, religion, and destiny? Winston Churchill believed that religion, especially Christianity, was important to Western civilization. He was convinced that the ethics informed by it were vital for the sanctification of democracy. Later in life, he meditated that it was, quote, "bad for a nation when it is without faith." But while Churchill was sincere in valuing Christian resources, that did not mean that he needed to attend to them concertedly as an adult. I would characterize Churchill in the words of Anthony Montague Brown as an optimistic agnostic. He was not an atheist, but perhaps he might be considered a deist. If so, that would place him in the company of another great man from another time, our own Thomas Jefferson. Churchill did not necessarily believe in God, but to the extent he did, he was certain that God believed in him. If that was indeed the case, the world of his day, as well as our own now, owes a debt both to that deity and to Winston Spencer Churchill himself. Thank you.
I loved that movie.
The movie's great. I do a talk called Churchill at the Movies about all the different films that have been made about him, with a lot of comment on this one and what's right and wrong about it, and some of the little historical errors that always creep into fiction. But it was a rousing film. And just one further comment on the film. It's hard to play Churchill in a lot of ways, and one of the challenges is that debates in the House of Commons, which was Churchill's natural theater, were never recorded or filmed. There are actually only even a few still photographs that someone took surreptitiously, and everyone said that his greatest performances, which is what they were on the floor of the House of Commons. The recordings you hear today of Churchill's speeches were made after the fact, and they don't have the same power and vigor, but sadly, there's no film of that. There actually is a very good film clip online of Churchill speaking to the U.S. Congress in December 1941, and that's, if you want a single film clip that really shows him in action as the speaker, that's the best one.
Okay, actually I have two questions, which I will be fast. And one is that why did he think it was cruel to rip away the superstitious nonsense that people have around them when they're religious? And second, he did something really awful in the First World War, a really bad decision that you didn't talk about.
Yes. Well, I would say the answer to the first question would be that he thought religion, at least for the time being, was a crutch that provided some support to people. His comment that eventually that crutch might be thrown away was recognized that, but I think he felt that Churchill was an aristocrat and elitist. Probably thought himself intellectually superior to the mass of people, which you could argue he was. So I think he felt that for ordinary people, religion had some positive, not entirely positive, but some positive values. That's how I would interpret that comment. The second thing you're referring to, I think, is Gallipoli, the campaign in 1915. I think a lot of you are familiar with this. It was an attempt which he was not entirely responsible for, but it was in part his effort to knock Turkey out of the war by landing British troops and imperial troops in the Gallipoli Peninsula. It was a terrible failure for lots of reasons. He took the blame, was kicked out of the cabinet. He thought he was 40 at the time. He'd had a meteoric rise to fame and power, and he thought his career was over. His wife, Clementine, famously said, "I thought he would die of grief." And Churchill was prone to discouragement, if not depression, during his life, and that was, other than 1940, that was the most challenging part of his life. He took up painting almost by accident as a solace, and painting was probably the single thing he did in his life that provided him with the most comfort other than his family. So what I would say about Gallipoli, that it wasn't entirely his fault, but he took the blame for it. So famous episode during the First World War.
You mentioned that as Prime Minister, he appointed a couple of archbishops.
Yes.
So is it still the case in Great Britain that the government appoints head of church?
I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that. Who appoints the archbishop? I think there are two archbishops in the Church of England, Canterbury and York, and I'd have to think about whether there's still some power on the part of the government to appoint those positions. Maybe someone else knows. I'm not an Anglican, so I'm a little bit vague on that. But it is still the established Church of England. The Queen is the head of the church. Defender of the faith is part of her title. But as Episcopalianism in America has dwindled to a very small following, the Church of England no longer has the following that it did in Britain, because Britain is, like everywhere else, has become a much more secularized country. So I'll check on that, and I'm not sure if that's... There is an interesting story about the current Archbishop of Canterbury, which you can find online, several years ago, finding that the person he thought who was his father actually was not, because his mother had had an affair with someone else. It makes an interesting sort of human interest story. Justin Welby is the current Archbishop of Canterbury, so that's worth looking up. It's an interesting saga.
Thanks for your talk.
You're welcome.
How did the general public's feeling about God and religion correspond to Churchill's, and were they aware of his feelings on it?
Well, obviously it was a more religious time than you're talking about 80 or 100 years ago. So the British public was certainly more God-fearing and church-going than it is today. And Britain's a very diverse country today. There's a significant Muslim population. Church observance has fallen off. The Church of England has lots of unused properties and churches that have been closed. Churchill skepticism about religion was not something that he would broadcast or trumpet. Certainly the majority of the Conservative Party. Someone described, and this is a paraphrase, I think, of an American description, that the Church of England was the Tory party at prayer. People say that about Republicans and Episcopalians here as well. So it wasn't something that he would broadcast or trumpet, because it wasn't good politics. And he went through the observances of going, at least on ceremonial occasions, to church, but it was not a regular habit of his, to say the least.
I'm to your left. Hi, thanks.
Sure.
So I have a question that's not very well formed, but there's a swirl in my head of a couple of things you said right in a minute. Of the Christian you said that at least Christianity was the product of science. Mm-hmm. There was some, when you were talking about the Muslim, his view of Islam. And you also said that they were fine, some individuals may be fine, but the Muslim or Islam as an organized religion was like bad or evil or something not good. And all of a sudden my mind is swirling about the difference between religion as a personal enterprise, as a social institution, and how he would conceptualize the Church of England as a civic entity that informs or doesn't inform how the British. He was the prime minister, and how does this society work, and what role does it have or not have, and if not the Church of England, where does ethics and morality and leadership of that type come in a society? Well,
I think he had his own view of ethics because he was very widely read. My sense is to say that he thought the Church of England was integral to British history and British national institutions. For Winston Churchill, history was not some dry, dusty thing from the past. It was part of his own being. He saw himself very consciously as the latest actor in the great pageant of British history. And certainly the Church and Christianity were, enmeshed with that in a way that couldn't be separated. So he thought of all the great institutions of British history, the monarchy, the parliamentary system, the church. They were all melded together in his mind, and it was a seamless web going back to, throughout the whole course of British history. Churchill had what is called the Whig view of history, which is that history, especially British history, was this continuous pageant and procession to greater liberties and all kinds of other good things. The reality of history is very different. Churchill wrote in the 1930s a series of 4 books called History of the English-Speaking Peoples. They were actually published in the 1950s. And it's very good popular narrative history, but it's entirely political and military. So things that historians care about today, economic history, social history, gender studies, those weren't things that factored into Churchill's view of history. But he was a wonderful writer, so if you want to read enjoyable popular history with a military and political narrative in it, anything he writes is wonderful to read. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry.
So I have a question regarding Churchill's relationship with Roosevelt, especially as the last phase of the war, Second World War II, when, according to Martin Gilbert, Roosevelt was incapacitated and did not, mostly his request to keep the troops, or not to withdraw the troops prematurely for parts of the Eastern Europe, were responded by Roosevelt associates or helpers there. And And a second question about the role of individual in the Second World War II, especially at the beginning, when there seemed like one country and one person was standing up to Hitler.
Yeah. Well, the whole subject of the relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt during the war is interesting. I spoke about that here a couple of years ago. There's a debate. This goes to what happened at the Yalta Conference, what could have been done to preserve the freedom of Eastern Europe. The great irony is that Britain and France declared war on Germany in September 1939 because it had invaded Poland. And then after 6 years of war, you end up with a world in which Poland is dominated once again by a totalitarian system. It happens to be communism instead of fascism. My own feeling is to say that the military realities in Europe in 1945 were what they were. The war had been won by American economic power and by Soviet lives. There's a debate among historians about how sick Franklin Roosevelt was. The Yalta Conference was February 1945. He died a few months later. Some people say that at Yalta he wasn't attentive. He wasn't, pursuing things the way he could have. Churchill was very frustrated later on in the war because he, as was inevitable, Britain became a second fiddle to the United States and the Soviet Union. Churchill recognized, perhaps earlier than Roosevelt, the Soviet threat, but there wasn't too much he could do about it. A year after the war, you have the famous Iron Curtain speech in March 1946, which is the clarion call for the West to resist any further Soviet expansion. So that's a couple of comments on that. The question of the role of individuals in history is an interesting one. I think Thomas Carlyle, the British historian in the 19th century, said, history is but the lives of great men. That's not a contemporary view, because we think of history today as the amalgam of all kinds of forces, and the role of individuals has been, in historical writing, has been diminished. That said, there are still times in history when a particular person at a particular time and place makes a difference. And the question of what would have happened if Churchill had not become prime minister in May 1940 is interesting, and the Darkest Hour film speaks to some of that. And you could have had a very different scenario if Lord Halifax had become prime minister instead of Churchill. There could have been some overture to Germany or some truce, and that would have solidified Nazi rule over Europe and would have enabled Hitler to turn all his resources on the attack on the Soviet Union. That could have been a whole different scenario. So people still make a difference in history, and Winston Churchill was arguably someone. Even his staunchest critics, who point out his intolerance of India, of Hinduism in India, and lots of other things he said, recognize that he played a unique role in history at a specific time.
I think it's very interesting.
Sure.
I had two questions. They might be the same. One is, what got you particularly interested in him, since there's many great figures, even of the period. And the second one, are there any myths about Churchill that you are particularly interested in demystifying?
Well, two answers to that. I spent my life in the business world. I tell people I have a master's degree from the University of Chicago, which is true, because I want them to think that it's in history. It was actually an MBA, which is a master's degree of a different kind. So I was always interested in history. I'm particularly in modern European and British history, 19th and 20th century. My father grew up in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, which was a very historic time to be alive for sure. So I came at Churchill from the perspective of modern history generally. Some people actually, some of our members, who know far more than I do, they can tell you what he had for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day of his life. They connect with Churchill because of his personality and character. We have some members who tell me quite candidly that they were going through difficult times in their lives, they were discouraged, depressed, whatever, and they started to read about Churchill, and Churchill's resolve and determination impressed them. They don't necessarily read much history in general. So that's my perspective. And what I would say is that Churchill had a uniquely long and interesting life at a time when the most important things happened in history. The 50 or 60 years from his rise to prominence when he was barely in his mid-20s. He was 80 when he retired as prime minister. That was the most interesting half century in a long time. 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the atomic age, communism, everything was going on, and he was involved with so many of those things. And that's what makes him an interesting person. You combine that with his very distinctive character and personality. He was a politician, a statesman, a painter, a writer, a historian, a cigar smoker, champagne drinker, bricklayer, loved animals. I don't do a standard sort of biographical talk about Churchill. He was born, he did this, and then he died, because you can read that in history books. But there's so many different aspects of his life. I have probably 10 different Churchill talks now, and you can find something interesting about him. I tell people, if you give a talk on Winston Churchill, you make him boring, then you've clearly done something wrong. And this new biography by Andrew Roberts that I mentioned is coming out in the U.S. the beginning of November. It's already out in Britain. It's got fantastic reviews. It's a big book. It's about 1,000 pages. But if you want to read a big, new, single-volume biography of Churchill, it's called Winston Churchill, Walking with Destiny. And Andrew's come up with a lot of new, interesting sources that people didn't utilize as much before. So if that's the new single-volume book to read. Oh, myths, yes. Yes. Let me try to address the myth question. There are lots of myths about Churchill, lots of quotations that are attributed to him. I think Abraham Lincoln once said, half the things that people say about me on the internet aren't true. And the same thing applies to Churchill. So there are lots of Churchill. The problem is some of the best quotes that are attributed to Churchill, and you can find them anywhere online, are things that sound like something he would have said, and things that he would say if he was alive. I wish I had said that, but I actually didn't. There are all kinds of myths about Churchill, that he was responsible for Gallipoli, for example, when it wasn't entirely his fault. The founder of the Churchill Society is a man named Richard Langworth, and he has a website that has a whole list of those, and actually a whole book about it. So there's, as with any other great figure, there's a lot of misinformation about Churchill. And as part of our purpose as the Churchill Society is to present an accurate record. We think of what we call Churchill in the round. And he was a very flawed person, as anyone is, and he made a lot of mistakes because he tried a lot of things. And the best way never to make a mistake is never do anything, but that's not a good recipe for getting along in life. So look up Richard Langworth's website and book, and there's a whole bunch of them.
You mentioned destiny. There are passing references in some of the stuff I've seen about Churchill about just how fiscally irresponsible he was at a personal level. He seemed to feel like it was his right to have Chartwell and not really pay his bills and all that. Can you say a little bit about how he scraped together in the years up till 1940?
Because he was the grandson of a duke, people think today, and certainly people thought then, we must have money. The Duke of Marlborough has a large estate and agricultural properties, but this is like Downton Abbey. All that goes to the eldest son. So his father's older brother became the 8th Duke in succession of the grandfather, and there wasn't much money. Jenny Jerome's family had some money, and that was sort of frittered away over the years. So Churchill, despite his aristocratic ancestry, had to make a living. And he also, as you point out, liked to live the good life, and he wasn't fiscally responsible. He was an aristocrat. He always had someone to draw his bath and do everything for him, because that was his lifestyle. So throughout his whole life, up until the Second World War, he had to scrounge around, and the way he could make money was by writing. And he wrote multiple volumes of history, biography, autobiography. He gave paid speeches all around the country. He did a lecture tour of the U.S. in the early 1930s and was paid hundreds of dollars per speech, which was a lot of money in the middle of the Depression. There's an excellent book from a couple of years ago called No More Champagne, and it's all about Churchill's personal finances. And the author David Locke dug up bank records and found a lot of stuff. So he was always scrounging around. There were a couple of times when he had to consider selling Chartwell, his beloved home, which he ultimately didn't do. And he got bailed out by some of his rich friends on a number of occasions. So that was a challenge. He also liked to gamble too. He spent time in the south of France. Finally, during the Second World War, some film producers paid him a big chunk of money for the film rights to some of his books. And then after the war, when his memoirs of the Second World War came out, I think Henry Luce, who ran Time Life in those days, paid Churchill something like $2 million for the U.S. rights to his book, so a lot of money. So he was not wealthy, the wealthiest person, but certainly by his 60s and 70s, he was comfortable. So that's an interesting story, and a lot of Churchill's critics during his political career thought of him as being reckless, lacking in judgment, impulsive, and you see that in his personal financial life, and Clementine would have preferred a much simpler life. They had 10 or 11 full-time staff at Chartwell, and the bills for champagne and wine and scotch were substantial, and cigars too. So that's an interesting part of his life that's worth reading about.
I just had a question more about Churchill rather than Churchill and religion. Shortly after he retired, his more or less protege who had been waiting in the wings, Anthony Eden, became prime minister. And not too long after that, he was involved in the Suez Affair, which was a complete catastrophe. I realize as a loyal Tory, I doubt that Churchill criticized him openly right at the time, but did he ever express any feelings about if he felt Suez was a catastrophe, or that Eden had done the right thing, or what?
The background to that is Anthony Eden, who was some years younger than Churchill, was sort of the golden boy of British politics in the 1930s, very handsome, dashing man. He was Foreign Secretary in 1938 in the Neville Chamberlain government, resigned in protest about the Munich Agreement, and then when Churchill took office in 1940, Eden became Foreign Secretary again. And everyone in the Conservative Party felt that he would be Churchill's successor, and a lot of people expected that when the war was over, Churchill was 71 when the war ended, and a lot of people thought he would certainly retire. And then when he lost the election in 1945, even more so. But he hung on. He couldn't see the world thriving without his involvement. So he hung on, far longer than anyone in the Conservative Party would have liked, and returned to power in 1951. And he was 80 when he retired. When you read about his second premiership from 1951 to 1955, it's full of stories about how the members of his cabinet and members of the Conservative Party were hoping, Winston, it's time for you to retire and enjoy. Everyone loves you, and you'd have a wonderful retirement. And he very stubbornly hung on. And there are actually some funny stories about all the scheming and contriving. Meanwhile, Eden was getting older. He was in poor health. So Churchill finally retires at the age of 80 in 1955, and Eden is his successor. And there's a quotation from Churchill when he's just retiring. He says to one of his private secretaries, "I don't think Antony can do it," meaning he's not going to be a success. And as it turned out, the following year, with the Suez crisis, the Eden government, Eden's prime ministership ended, a year later, so he was only prime minister from 1955 to 1957. From what I recall, Churchill, certainly felt that Suez was a fiasco and blamed the United States for putting pressure on Britain and France and Israel to withdraw. I think, if I remember correctly, Churchill would have pursued that further and more aggressively, and he thought the mistake was not, like most people, he regarded Nasser as a tin pot dictator who should be dealt with in the same way that dictators were dealt with previously. And I'll look this up again, but I think he felt that the U.S. pulled the rug out from under Britain and France, which is pretty much what happened.
Thank you. Great talk. I'm sorry I missed the first few minutes.
Okay.
So he's a conservative, and I'm curious how progressive he was. I mean, England has the dominion over so much of the world, the people of color, dealing with women. I mean, is he progressive in any of those things?
I mentioned a few things. keep in mind that although Churchill ended as a conservative and started as a conservative, he was a liberal for 20 years in between. He was elected to Parliament in 1900 when he was 26, and was an up-and-coming, rising star in politics. His family, of course, were all conservatives, and his social circle was. In 1904, he very famously walked across the floor of the House of Commons to sit with the Liberals. That was a dispute over free trade and tariffs. But Churchill, in his 20s and 30s, was progressive, certainly by the standards, or liberal by the standards of British politics of the day. And he remained a liberal, through that time. He was Home Secretary I think from 1908 or 1910 on. And he and David Lloyd George, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Asquith conservative government, brought in a lot of, progressive and novel social legislation for pensions and unemployment insurance. So he had this, quite liberal phrase about him. There's an article from a couple months ago in Commentary Magazine, which is worth reading. I think it's called Churchill's Tory Rebellion. It's all about his liberal phase. What changed that was in part because the Liberal Party collapsed after the end of the First World War, and he was a man without a party. He went back to the Conservatives, became more conservative later in life, was a critic of the socialist policies of the Labour Party and of Clement Attlee's government, which replaced him in 1945. And if you're looking for gems of Churchill quotes, there are a bunch of them about socialism is the philosophy of failure and the politics of greed and stuff like that. But he had a very good personal relationship with Attlee, and one of the things about the Darkest Hour movie that I think it gets wrong is that it doesn't bring out how important the support of Attlee and the Labour Party were to Churchill. The opening scene of Darkest Hour is Clement Attlee making the speech on the floor of the House of Commons, yelling at Chamberlain to resign. Clement Attlee was a very mild-mannered, quiet man. He was called Clam, or the Mouse, by people. But he was a very honorable, intelligent, admirable person. And during the war, he was Churchill's effective number two. And while Churchill was waging the war and dealing with foreign policy, Attlee helped to run the domestic economy. So Churchill went through these different phases in life, from being a conservative to a liberal, back to being a conservative. But he was always very respectful of his political opponents, Attlee in particular, and they actually had a good relationship, especially during the war years. His government was a coalition government of all three political parties. Maybe you need that in the United States these days, I don't know. It's another story.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a great talk.
Thank you.